Maggie Thornfield never thought life would come to this. Just 3 years ago, she was living the dream: a steady career as a marketing executive, a beautiful home in the suburbs, and what she believed was a stable marriage. On the outside, her life looked picture perfect. But behind the polished smiles and carefully planned family photos, cracks had been forming. And when the marriage collapsed, it didn't just end with heartbreak. It ended with Maggie losing everything. The house she decorated with love, gone. The savings she thought were secure, emptied. The career she had poured nearly a decade into, stripped away overnight. In the space of a few brutal months, Maggie's world collapsed around her. And at 42 years old, she found herself with nothing left: no home, no income, no safety net. Just her 11-year-old daughter, Iris, and a battered old car that became the only roof they had over their heads. Night after night, Maggie lay awake in the driver's seat, staring at the dim glow of streetlights through the rain-soaked windshield, wondering how it had all unraveled so quickly. How a life that once felt so secure could be reduced to survival in parking lots and rest stops. But as she looked at her daughter, sleeping in the back seat with her backpack as a pillow, Maggie knew one thing for certain. She couldn't give up. Not now. Not ever. The settlement was cruel. Ruthless, even. Bank accounts she had carefully built over years were wiped clean. The apartment she thought of as her safe space was suddenly locked, the keys changed before she could even gather her daughter's clothes. And the career she had devoted nearly a decade of her life to gone, taken from her when her ex-husband's family cut her out of the company. At 42 years old, Maggie Thornfield went from being a professional with a steady income to a woman with nothing but a stack of court papers and a few crumpled bills. Her checking account balance, $847. That was all she had to rebuild a life for herself and her daughter. So she drove. Aimlessly. The windshield wipers beating a nervous rhythm against storm clouds. At night, the Walmart parking lot became their refuge. Maggie would recline her seat just enough to make it look like rest. Iris would curl up in the back, using her backpack as a pillow. To her daughter, she called it an adventure. "It's like camping," she'd say with a smile she didn't feel. But deep down, Maggie knew this wasn't camping. This was survival. And each night, as she stared at the ceiling of that cramped car, Maggie whispered the same promise to herself. "I will find a way. I have to." Life in the bus was brutal. At night, the metal shell turned into an icebox, every breath forming a cloud in the dark. By midday, the same walls baked like an oven, trapping the heat until it was unbearable. Rain seeped through cracks in the roof, dripping onto their makeshift bedding. Each storm sounded like 1,000 hammers beating down on thin steel, a reminder that this wasn't really a home, just survival on wheels. Their money was running out. Meals became smaller. Nights grew longer. And yet, through it all, Maggie refused to surrender. One afternoon, while Iris sketched sunflowers on scraps of paper to decorate their new home, Maggie opened a worn leather-bound book she'd carried since childhood, her grandmother Rosalie's recipe collection. The pages smelled faintly of cinnamon and thyme, filled with handwritten notes and small reminders of a woman who had survived her own hardships. Maggie didn't have much. Just a bag of flour, a packet of yeast, and a tiny camping stove balanced on the old bus seat. But with trembling hands, she mixed the dough, kneaded it on a scratched wooden board, and set it to rise near the window where sunlight streamed in. Hours later, the bus was filled with a smell they hadn't known in weeks, the smell of fresh bread. Warm, comforting, alive. Iris's eyes lit up. "It smells like Grandma's house," she whispered. They broke the loaf apart with their hands, steam rising in the cool air. It was simple, imperfect, but in that moment it was more than food. It was a reminder that they could still create something good, even in the hardest of times. For the first time since the divorce, Maggie felt something stir inside her chest. Not fear. Not despair. But hope. One evening, as twilight settled over the parking lot where they had parked the bus, a gentle knock echoed against the metal door. Maggie froze. Encounters at night usually meant trouble. Her heart pounded as she opened the door a crack. Standing outside was an elderly man with kind eyes and flour still dusting the sleeves of his cardigan. His name was Harold, a retired pastry chef who lived in the nearby apartments. I couldn't help it, he said with a small smile. I smelled the bread. Real bread. Not from a machine. Not from a store. From scratch. Maggie braced for judgment, another reminder of how far she had fallen. But instead of scolding her for parking there, Harold surprised her. You've got talent, he said. And a good recipe. If you'd like, you can use my kitchen. Proper ovens. Real tools. I'd be happy to show you a few tricks. For Maggie, it felt like a lifeline. For Iris, it felt like magic. In Harold's kitchen, a new world opened. He showed them how to feel the dough instead of just measuring it. How bread was alive, yeast breathing, flour transforming, crusts forming golden armor around soft, tender hearts. Maggie's hands, once trained only for typing and presentations, began to move with rhythm and confidence. Iris, wide-eyed, watched Harold sprinkle flour across the counter like it was stardust. Together, the three of them worked late into the evenings. Maggie and Iris weren't just baking bread anymore, they were learning traditions passed down for generations, secrets tucked between recipes, wisdom kneaded into every batch. And slowly, something extraordinary began to rise. Not just loaves of bread, but Maggie's belief that maybe, just maybe, they could build a new life from this. Their very first customer came by chance. One morning, as Maggie set a tray of cinnamon rolls on the tiny counter by the bus window, the warm scent drifted through the lot. A police officer on patrol caught the smell and followed it to their door. "What is that?" he asked, curious. "Just something I baked," Maggie replied nervously, half expecting him to tell them to move along. Instead, Iris piped up with a smile, "It's cinnamon rolls. My mom made them. Do you want to try one?" The officer hesitated, then accepted. He took a bite. And his expression said everything. His eyes widened, his shoulders relaxed, and for a long moment, he just stood there in silence, chewing slowly, savoring. "This," he said finally, "is the best thing I've tasted in years." Word traveled faster than Maggie could have imagined. The next day, the officer returned with 2 firefighters. The day after, neighbors came, curious about the bus lady's rolls. Each person who tasted her pastries walked away impressed and told someone else. Before long, there was a steady stream of people coming by. Not just for bread, not just for sweets, but for a piece of comfort, something warm and handmade in a world that often felt cold. And that old, rusty school bus, once just a desperate shelter, had transformed into something entirely new. It wasn't just a roof over their heads anymore. It was a bakery. A rolling bakery. And for the first time in a long time, Maggie felt like she was moving forward. With Iris as her partner and Harold as her guide, Maggie began turning scraps of hope into something real. Every recipe became a collaboration, her grandmother Rosalie's handwritten notes, Harold's decades of pastry wisdom, and Iris's bright imagination. Together, they transformed the battered school bus into more than just a shelter. It became the heart of a new venture. They called it Rosalie's Rolling Bakery, a tribute to the woman whose words had carried Maggie through the darkest nights. The secret ingredient is starting over, with love. At first, it was just a handful of curious customers, a firefighter bringing home a loaf, a teacher buying cookies for her class. But word spread quickly. People weren't just coming for bread. They were coming for the story, for the warmth that seemed baked into every roll and loaf. Soon, lines began to form outside the painted bus, neighbors and strangers waiting patiently for the chance to taste something special. Local farmers' markets invited them to set up shop. Families drove across town just to buy a dozen of Iris's sunshine rolls, the glazed pastries that had become their signature. The money wasn't much. Not yet. But it was steady. It was honest. Enough to cover food. Enough to fix the bus. Enough to breathe a little easier at night. For the first time since the divorce, Maggie felt the weight of fear begin to lift. Survival was no longer the only goal. Now, she and her daughter could dream. Then came the turning point. One afternoon, a well-known food blogger stopped by the bus, curious about the growing buzz. She ordered a roll, their signature creation, a soft cinnamon spiral topped with a golden honey sunflower glaze that glistened in the sun. She took one bite. And in that moment, Maggie and Iris's quiet little bakery changed forever. That evening, The blogger sat down to write. Her review wasn't just praise, it was poetry. She described the rolls as sunlight you could taste and called the Bus Bakery the most extraordinary pastry shop in America, hidden inside a converted school bus. By dawn, the article had gone viral. Shared thousands of times. Then tens of thousands. Overnight, Maggie and Iris went from serving a handful of locals to fielding calls from news stations. Reporters wanted interviews. Customers drove for hours just to stand in line. The next morning, before they even opened, a crowd stretched down the block, people holding phones with the article pulled up, eager to see if the legend was true. And it didn't stop there. Within days, national outlets were calling. TV crews wanted footage. And then, the unthinkable. The Food Network. They wanted their story. A mother and daughter who had turned heartbreak and a broken-down bus into something magical. What began as survival had now become a sensation. And then, one day, the past came walking back. As Maggie handed out warm loaves to a line of eager customers, a sleek black Mercedes pulled up. Out stepped her ex-husband, Robert, and behind him, the Ashworths, the in-laws who had once laughed as they stripped her life away. They joined the line like ordinary customers, their polished shoes and expensive coats looking out of place among the crowd of neighbors, firefighters, and families. Maggie's heart clenched at the sight of them. Memories of courtrooms, of humiliation, of doors slammed in her face came rushing back. For a moment, the old fear stirred. But then she saw something else. Her daughter Iris, standing proudly by the window, handing out sunshine rolls with the ease of a seasoned baker. Customers smiling, calling Maggie by name, thanking her for bringing comfort into their day. A line stretching down the block, all for her. When the Ashworths finally reached the front, they accepted the pastries with stiff politeness, clearly unsettled by the sight of Maggie thriving. They took cautious bites. And even they couldn't hide it, their eyes widened, their guarded expressions melting into surprise. Maggie watched, but she didn't need their reaction. She didn't need their words. For the first time, she understood something clearly. She didn't need their approval. She didn't need their validation. She had already won. Not with lawyers. Not with money. But with resilience, love, and the life she built from nothing. Then came the offer that would change everything. A famous restaurateur from New York, a man whose restaurants were known across the country, had heard their story, tasted their pastries, and saw something rare. He didn't just want their recipes. He wanted to give them a stage big enough to match their courage. With Harold's blessing, and Iris's excitement shining brighter than the city lights, Maggie made the choice. They would take the leap. The journey east was more than just miles on a map. It was a shedding of the past. Every landmark they passed was a reminder of how far they had come, from parking lot nights to farmers' market mornings, from tears in the dark to laughter around ovens. And then, at last, they arrived. In Brooklyn, on a crisp autumn morning, Maggie and Iris opened the doors to their new bakery. They called it Rosalie's Rising, honoring the grandmother whose recipes and wisdom had carried them through the storm. The old school bus, freshly painted with sunflowers, was parked proudly outside the shop. No longer a symbol of desperation, but of resilience. A rolling reminder of the nights they refused to give up. On opening day, the line stretched for blocks. Customers cheered as the first trays of sunshine rolls came steaming out of the ovens. Harold was there, beaming with pride, his hands folded like a master watching his students step into their own. As Maggie looked around at the bustling bakery, at Iris greeting customers with joy, at the bus shining in the morning light, she realized something. They hadn't just built a business. They had built a new life. And every loaf, every roll, every smile that passed through their doors carried the same secret ingredient. The courage to start over, with love. From a burnt-out life, to a rusty old bus, to a thriving bakery in the heart of Brooklyn. Maggie's journey had come full circle. What began with loss and humiliation had transformed into something beautiful, not because she had wealth or privilege, but because she refused to stop moving forward. In her grandmother Rosalie's recipe book, there had been a simple note, written in faded ink: the secret ingredient is starting over, with love. For months, those words were just a comfort, a lifeline in the dark. But now, as Maggie stood in her bustling bakery, Sunlight pouring through the windows, her daughter laughing beside her, she understood them fully. Starting over wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. And in that love, kneaded into every loaf, glazed into every roll, shared in every smile, Maggie built far more than a business. She built a home, a future, and a legacy that would rise, just like her bread, with every new dawn.